Well, hey, Dr. Little. We've been having a conversation recently about this idea of Christian sacrifice and what it means to live a life of denying ourselves, picking up our cross, and following Jesus. And I wanted to hop on here and have this conversation, not only because I'm genuinely curious to get your thoughts on it, but I think it really could be a help to people who might listen to this also.
Mm.
So the reason that this is, I think, particularly relevant today is it seems that it's never been easy to deny the flesh, to deny myself, to pick up my cross and follow Christ. I mean, the scriptures seem very clear. It doesn't make light of that. That's not an easy thing to do. But in our present culture, it seems, in my own experience and from what I observe, it seems that it's just harder than ever, given maybe what's happened in our culture, where we've got to, so much of the confusion not even outside of the church, but in the church. And so when I think about Jesus telling me to deny myself, pick up my cross, and follow after him, what I see is that I think many people think that what it means to really sacrifice and to follow Christ is sort of the obvious stuff. I might get ridiculed for saying that salvation is exclusively through Jesus Christ. Of course, I have to abstain from the really obviously immoral things that I'm not supposed to do as a Christian. And that may cost me. But as I read the New Testament, it seems that the idea of Christian sacrifice, and based off our previous conversations that we've had offline, is much deeper, and that it's supposed to touch every facet of my life, what it means to really follow Christ and to be in the world but not of the world. So I want to just talk through that and kind of make our way through. Do you see this same phenomenon that I think I see in my own life today, the difficulty of this, maybe where the church has slid backwards in this area, and what might be some of the examples of the lack of this that we see today?
Well, surely I've seen that. And I think most people who are looking in a non-naive way, people who are not just sitting around all the cheerleaders telling how wonderful we're doing, would see this. I don't know that sacrifice or the lack thereof is necessarily a feature unique to our situation. But what may be different about it is how it looks. That is, what would sacrifice look like in the first century? Well, of course, in that time, it would have, as we know from writings, it would have involved things like financial sacrifice. That is, you might lose your job, particularly if you were a Jewish believer and you would no longer belong to the guild. You could lose your job, and so what do we find? Well, the truth is, Paul takes up an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Why are they poor? That's a financial thing. However, today, I don't see in the Western culture, that is.
Mm-hmm.
I think our type of sacrifice falls along different lines. And as you have pointed out, they're not quite as obvious.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulty of it, is we just get so used to the way things are that we might not question if that's the way they ought to be. And where in all times and places, to varying degrees, we know that the world has seeped into the church, and none of us have been faithful completely. But today I'm interested in, looking at those areas and saying, where are those areas where maybe we're not that aware because they're not as obvious. I mean, in the days of the early church, as you mentioned, the most obvious form of sacrifice would have been the ultimate, paying with your own life for faithfulness to Christ,
Right.
as many of the disciples did. It's really unlikely that we're going to face that in our day, in the Western context. I don't know what the next 10, 20, 30 years hold, but at least today, I feel no sense of threat when I go to church and worship with fellow believers that somebody's going to come in and gun us all down or something. That's just not something that we face. So aside from the more obvious ones like that, here are some things I've observed, and I wonder if you've seen them too. Take the church planting movement, for example. And I went down this road, Jennifer and I, we walked down this path, and we were looking into potentially working with a certain organization to look at planting a church.
Mhm.
And as we got more information in the process and what you typically do when you try to plant a church, one of the things we saw that was just discouraging was that many new church planters will kind of canvass their neighborhood before they plant the church, and they run these surveys of asking their lost neighbors, what would you like to see in a local church?
Mm.
And they gather up all that data, and they come back, and and let's just say with good intentions even. I'm sure they mean to reach their community for Christ. I'm not throwing rocks at these people. I'm just saying that's what we observed. And they come back, and then they literally structure this church plant based to some degree off that data that they've captured from lost people. And I just look at that and I think, is that not an expression of trying, again, with good intentions, as much as we can, to be as much like the world as possible? And is that really to be the motive and the aim of a Christian? That's just one example. I mean, we could name any. You probably have some in your mind. Any others that would show us this lack of a real sacrifice among Christians?
Yeah, I think what as you point out here, as you kind of mentioned this, you implied it. And the reason that the sacrifice issue is so difficult is because its 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 difficulty is created by the amount of accommodation that the church has to the culture. And so, I was just thinking as you were speaking, let's take education. There we see a lack of sacrifice in education. Why? Well, because we want our seminaries to give them degrees so that they're more professional and that they'll be able to reach more people and all that. I went down that road myself, thinking that's what we had to do. But when we do that, we just realize the reason that people don't see that we've lost sacrifice is that we've bought in to this idea that, oh, well, this is the right way to go. So we sacrifice good scholarship. We sacrifice good research because, after all, they can put it in any terms they want. And again, I'm trying to be careful here, but really what we're looking at, though we talk about scholarship, etc., in all of this, the fact is what we're looking at is giving people a graduate degree so
Yeah.
that they will. I know Os Guinness has talked about this. So in the area, but you see, the accommodation comes up first, and
Yeah.
then we say, well, no, this is the right thing to do. So I don't have to sacrifice anything here. And I can think
Mm.
in the marketplace. Now I realize that this is a matter of personal, to some degree, personal choice. But when I see that there is a products on the market, and I know that has been that product has come into being by slave labor.
Mm.
Uh, so the sacrifice there is to say, no, I'm not going to buy this product. I'm going to buy a different product. And I try to be kind of conscious. I know you can't do that with everything, but on
Sure.
the obvious, if I buy clothing and I look on the tag and it says it's China, I bought it online, let's say, I just make a note. I'll not buy from that vendor again.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of thing. But it says we become so much like the world that we say, oh, well, what difference would it make? Well, it doesn't matter what difference it makes. It matters about my own soul.
Mm.
Um, I, I just, no names, but just recently I was at a dentist and I had to have a 4-unit bridge done $5,000. And I also had to have an implant, which was another $5,000.
Mm.
Well, within about 5 months, the implant failed. Not the implant itself, but the appliance they put on the implant. Now, nobody could know that. Well, then what happened is they had to cut my bridge because the tooth it was anchored to had to be removed because it had a I think it was a vertical crack in it.
Mm-hmm.
So now that put that together, and now we've got $10,000. So I went to my dentist, and the first thing I had done was he looked at my tooth that needed to have the crown made, and I go up to pay, and the lady there says, which has to be his wife, she says, "Bruce, put your money away. Well, we haven't discussed what we're going to do about this." I said, "Okay." So she said, "Now you need to come back and have impressions made because I'm going to replace the unit bridge with a partial." And she said, "Okay." So I went back and came up to the front again, got my card out, and she said, "Put it away. We're not charging you any of this for anything." I said, "Excuse me." And she said, "Well, we just believe." And I said, "Yeah, but you don't eat belief." She said, "No, but they said we do have to look ourselves in the mirror." And then he came out because he saw I was having this conversation. He said, "Bruce, this is what we want to do. Maybe we're not obligated to do it, but we think it's the right thing to do." Now, illustrating, yes, of course, it makes a great difference to me.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. But the fact of the matter is that somebody would just make that choice based upon who they are. And I'm thinking for
Yeah.
Christians, we don't think that way often. We live too much out of the soul of the world. And consequently, now it's $10,000 for this man. And he's going to eat that. That affects him financially. Now you say, well, he's a dentist. He's probably got plenty. That's immaterial to the discussion.
Right. Right.
And I think it illustrates. So Christians say, well, it doesn't really matter. I can buy this even though it's hurting somebody else. So I think in the marketplace, there are areas where we just simply aren't up to what I would say sacrifice.
Yeah.
And then churches, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
In churches, some time ago, and I think you might remember this, what I did. I think maybe it was my faculty, my retirement lecture. I think that's what it
Oh
was.
yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember that well.
yes. And I talked about how this accommodation to the world has built a mindset for us that we want options. We are not willing to sacrifice. We want to have options. So I want options with the kind of service I have. I want options with the kind of music I have. No, so churches have to have a smorgasbord of things. We have to have this service that's dedicated to this, that service. Oh, we have to have 25 different Sunday school classes because I want options. That is something that's come out of the world, hasn't come out of Christianity. No, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have several Sunday school classes. That's not my point. But my
Sure.
point is, why have we done this? We've done it because people are demanding options.
Mm.
We want options.
That brings up a question. So you pastored how many churches throughout your ministry?
4.
4 churches.
3, really.
Okay. This thing about wanting options. Early in your ministry, did you see that? Way back in the day, is this more of a newer phenomenon?
Oh, it is a totally new phenomenon. And you see, that's why this comes right back, circles around your other word you're using, sacrifice.
Hmm.
See, I want to have my options to be here or not be here. So Sunday school teachers, well, yeah, I'll teach for a quarter. I don't mean uh,
The
25.
money, the time period.
But when I passed it, the folks who played the piano and the organ, we didn't have any drums. The I didn't have to say that.
That's all right.
Uh, those it happened to be two ladies I can think now. One of the churches I was at. They'd never been paid, and they ordered their personal lives, their family lives, around being in church on Sunday to play, and they never were paid.
Hmm.
And you could depend on them week in and week out. That's not true anymore. Now, that one reason is that we're paying our musicians.
Yeah.
And so, but one of the reasons we pay them, and I don't want to short shrift somebody, but this is how we get them to commit.
Yeah.
As an obligation. That there are many things, but that's one area why you just wouldn't have seen it. People would have. I remember a lady in one of my churches. My goodness, she served in the nursery. God bless her. For years, always filling in. Oh, if this person didn't come, now we're getting later, getting into the 80s, and you had some of the younger people coming and thinking, no, well, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. I know I signed up, and this lady, but she was the older lady,
Hmm.
and she had that sense of commitment. I'm speaking with as I say, painting with a broad brush. I know
Yeah.
that there are exceptions to everything, but as we see that trend, as you speak of, I
Yeah.
think that trend is something at least new to me. I started pastoring in 1968.
Hmm.
It was a long time
Yeah.
ago.
I know that when I think about some of the churches I've been involved in throughout my life and ministry, I see a difference with the older people in these churches
Mhm.
than my own generation and younger. And coming up through seminary, we kind of had this idea, and it was unbelievably arrogant. But I had it too, and it was that we're going to correct the theology of the
Yeah.
former generation. They got it wrong. They didn't. They weren't as sound in their thinking. They weren't maybe even as academic in their Christianity. So we're going to come in and we're going to really give them the goods and turn this thing around. And as much as we wanted to do a good work with that, I think many of us were blinded by the arrogance, and even we failed to see the good qualities of the previous generation. And the one that stands out to me is the one that you're kind of hitting at here with this lady in the nursery. The
Mhm.
level of commitment. I mean, I can remember I remember a church that I served at, and it went through some difficult days. It didn't matter what that church went through, though. The older saints there, they were there. They
Yeah.
were going to show up. You'd have to drag them out no matter what happened. It's just the level of commitment that was there. And I
Mhm.
know that in my generation and younger, to our own shame, and we'd have to lie to deny it, it's just not the same. It's so easy to hop in and hop out. And I think that's a real difference. Something has changed. What has happened?
Yeah, Schaeffer brought this out in the Great Evangelical Disaster. Now we know that is written in 1984. Later, David Wells will point these same things out when he wrote in the early 1990s. His first book, No Place, Whatever Happened to Evangelical Theology, or No
Oh,
Place for
it's
Truth.
this one here.
Yeah, No
Yeah,
Place
I've
for
just been
Truth.
reading this.
Um, see, I remember the day, and I'm guilty of it. I know I am. As you say, I'd have to lie to deny it. So I came to Christ when I was 20 years old, 1965. And when I started attending a small Bible school, then I started hearing all of this talk about the older generation. And because I was in New England, it was the fundamentalists. The fundamentalists had ruined the church. That was the cry. You failed the generation. You didn't reach your culture, and all that. And
Hmm.
maybe there's some truth to that. I'm not saying there's not, but
Hmm.
it was a wholesale denial, belittling.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, they say throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and not going to the right place to make the correction. The correction wasn't to turn aside to what others had done. But where we thought they were areas that could have correction is try to come along and not, as you say, be arrogant, but work with. But we acted as if we had all the answers in the world. And it's easy to criticize them because, yeah, there were some issues. I'm not denying that, but I
Sure.
saw people, Brian, I saw men and women, families serving Christ. And I know that I went to one of their homes and they lived in a condemned home because the people in the community would not sell them or rent to them because he was a Christian evangelical pastor. They lived in the home they lived in, there was dirt on the floor. I remember them asking me for dinner one day. They put on their best. Fried cabbage with peanut butter. Now, when I think how I treated those people, I repent of my sin. I feel so badly about that. Because how behind their backs, how I spoke against them and laughed at them and all these old fundamentalists. But they had certain things right.
Yeah.
They knew the world corrupted.
Yeah. There was another thing that I noticed, not just a lack of maybe commitment to show up and to support the church financially. I mean, that would be another one. Everybody who's had any involvement in newer church plants knows that they tend to attract the younger crowd, and when the younger people come, they're not as faithful to give to support the ministry, and so many of these churches, they have to rely on other churches who have older people who give more than what that church needs to then fund this other church because it's such a problem with the younger believers the younger people who are coming. And I see that. But the thing that struck me as you were just talking was I could think back to, I'm grateful that my parents took me to church when I was young, although I didn't become a Christian until I was 20. But some of my earliest memories of the church were there was still at least a sense of reverence.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that had slipped even, I'm thinking to the early 80s. I'm sure even then it had slipped quite a bit from what it had been, but I don't remember the pastor or the people involved in conducting the service being put off or afraid of a sense of reverence. That seemed like they were okay with it. But that's another one of the things that really has changed when you look at where we're at today in modern day evangelicalism, that almost a sense of reverence is, if things get a little too reverent, a little too serious, you see the pastor will sling a joke in there to try to lighten the mood. I have felt that temptation myself, not to just, again, throw rocks at these guys. I've probably done it myself. And when the struggle was, I don't want to appear unrelatable to these people. I want to be able to relate to them. And the way I got to relate is got to be a little lighthearted and let them know we're just like you. And I think, of course, the desire to say, I want to relate, there's probably something good there.
Yes.
But it's come so far to where it's almost we're ashamed of what I think a more fitting expression of Christian worship would really bring.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen that throughout as you think back to your early days of pastoring and then what you see today.
Why, yes, isn't it true? And I watch myself evolve. And I think I did the same thing. I thought, yeah, this is what we need to do. So then I'm thinking, what it looks like is, oh, well, the pastor's got to be a good jokester. He's, and I think, well, but what part does that play in being behind, as they used to call, the sacred desk? And then, of course, we remove the sacred desk.
For the business podium.
Yeah, and precisely. And then I went through that time, and I didn't want. We built a building, a new facility, and I said to the men, "Don't let it look like a church." Now that's how far I had. And I had turned my back on what I had known after I became a Christian, and I sat. It was probably only 15, no, 25 years ago that I just began to realize how wrong this actually was. And I think Schaeffer was one
Mm-hmm.
that helped me to see through some of this. But, not to sound overly spiritual, but, just reading your Bible, particularly you read pastoral epistles, and you just realize, now this is really serious business.
Yeah. Yeah. The seriousness of it is, for whatever reason today, something that people can only tolerate in small doses.
Yeah.
And they feel that they've got to kind of lighten it up. But when I have been in a service where a pastor has stood up and preached, and there was that sense of the weightiness of what
Yes.
we're dealing with and what we have to say, that we have, just as Peter responded on the one occasion when the Lord said, "Would you like to go away as well?" And he said, "Lord, to where would I go? You have the words of eternal life." He knew that what Christ was, who he was, and what he was saying was life and death important, as is all the Bible. And there's just a different sense of it entirely when you sit in a service and you hear a pastor preach who has that weightiness to it. And I'll tell you, you've listened to a lot more than I have and read an awful lot more than I have on Schaeffer. But I have heard this from person after person, from people who got to see him. I have some friends who saw him speak at an event, and they described it the same way. They said there was such a hush when he would speak. There was such a sense of the weightiness of the importance of what he had to say. In that context, a joke just wouldn't be important. I mean, rather, a joke wouldn't be fitting. It just wouldn't fit. And what little I have watched of Schaeffer, and it comes through his writings too, you get a sense of the reverence and the awe that he has for the material he's dealing with.
Yes.
I don't see that as much anymore.
And I'm not saying that the people, nor do I think you are, saying these people don't think it's important, but they've been overcome in an accommodation to the culture and thinking everybody needs to be entertained.
Yeah.
And so I really need to entertain. And of course, the mistake is that you can do that without affecting the seriousness of the weightiness, as you say, of the message. The idea of Marshall McLuhan, that the message, the medium is the message, that may be a little overstatement. But the fact is, if I'm if I'm behind the pulpit or I'm behind the plexiglass, and I got my one hand in the pocket, and I'm just kind of relaxed and all of that. You see, that undercuts the idea of solemnity.
Mm.
That
Mm-hmm.
that truth is always important, and it has to be declared in a way that undergirds its importance. I have a experience where a pastor, after we've sung a great, let's say a great hymn, but he will then make a joke about it, and not about the content, but probably usually the title. And I'm trying to think of one right now, but I can't. Where it's he takes the title and flips it a little bit and makes a funny about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, there's no place for that.
Yeah. I can remember, especially when I had just become a Christian at the age of 20, and I came out of a really rough background of drug addiction, pretty much running as hard and fast as I could away from God. And when I became a Christian, although I had heard these hymns my whole life, because my parents had me in church from the time I was young, they never meant anything to me. In fact, I didn't like the sound of them. And I can remember all of a sudden when we would sing something like Amazing Grace or How Great Thou Art, I really loved the song How Great Thou Art, and some of the other hymns. Suddenly, after I'd become a Christian, now I'm listening to the meaning of the songs. And this was back before they redid them and made them fast and amped up like a modern rock song. This was back when they sang them how they used to be. And I could listen to those and just be in tears, thinking about how grateful I was that God would even consider forgiving me, giving the kind of a life I had lived, what I had just shook a clenched fist in his face, basically. And for me, I'd heard the gospel. I wasn't one of these people that I thought, well, I grew up in an atheistic home, so who would have expected anything different from me? No, I grew up in a home where my parents steered me in the right direction, and I just tuck-tailed and went the other direction. So I would hear these songs, and to your point, if somebody had told a joke after that, it would have just seemed it's on a piano playing a song. Somebody just hits the wrong note, and you'd go, oh, you'd think that doesn't fit. There was nothing to joke about.
It's like singing "Pop Goes the Weasel" at a funeral.
Yeah, and everybody would be wondering, who picked that? Why does that? You mentioned David Wells earlier. I'm reading through his book again, No Place for Truth, and I was just thinking as we're talking, I know we're talking about a lot of ideas, and we're throwing around terms like the church, the world, the culture, sacrifice, and it's probably helpful to work through some of those terms and to define what we mean by that. Wells puts his finger on something that, again, I can't point out and say, look at the mess out there, because I feel some of the results of it in my own life. So I have to say, Lord, help me here, because I've succumbed to some of this myself. But he talks about the fragmentation of thinking, and how just one of the characteristics of modern life is there is so much of a fragmentation. In that it's hard to have a unity of thought that would start with, why am I here? What does it mean to be a human being? What is the real purpose of life? And how does everything flow out from that and stay connected to that? Obviously, the modern the world out there in what we just call the world outside of the church, we would expect that to be a confused mess. But Wells's point is, well, that's gotten into the church an awful lot too. So I'll just read this here as we maybe can make our way into talking through some of these terms. He says, those who are conversant with the ways in which the modern world has been analyzed will recognize, even in this brief sketch, themes that are all too familiar. Whatever else one may say about modernization, one of its principal effects has been to break apart the unity of human understanding and to disperse the multitude of interests and undertakings away from the center, in relation to which they have gathered their meaning, pushing them to the edges, where they have no easy relation to another. He says later, have we not substituted the relative for the absolute, the many for the one, diversity for unity, and the human for divine, our own private religious experience for truth that was once also public and universal in scope? And then in just a couple more lines, he goes on, those who see so plainly the effects of modernization do not, however, always see so well how this fragmentation has been loosed in the church. Though largely unnoticed, the same dynamic is also at work here. In the church, too, the center has been fractured, and the fragments of belief are scattered to the edges. Here, too, the person of understanding has been supplanted by the specialist. And he just talks about that idea of fragmentation. So I know as we're talking through this, we're saying things like the church, the world, the culture. I wanted to talk it out with you to get a clear understanding of when we say these things, what do we actually mean? So probably it's helpful to start with the church. What if we went and polled even 10 evangelicals today? Who knows what we'd come back with, if we're being honest, if we asked, what is the church? What does it mean? What's its purpose? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So let's just start out the most basic. Linguistically, according to the lexicon, church is ecclesia, simply means called out. So, but it's interesting that that's what is used to talk about this group that we call Christians, we call believers. Theologically, then, you have to, well, before we get to theologically, you have to ask yourself the question, all right, so it's to be called out, but then the question comes, called out from what to what?
Yeah, necessarily if you're called out, you're coming from
Yeah,
something to something.
precisely.
Yeah.
It's like Israel they were led out of Egypt, but it wasn't just to get them out of Egypt. It was to get them into the land that God had promised.
Yeah.
So then we ask ourselves the question, as we search the scriptures, so what does the church mean fundamentally? Just the term. Well, it means called out. Theologically, it means that we have been called out of the world. So that's the out. And we've been called into God's kingdom of light, as Colossians tells us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the very fact that we've been called out of the world tells us that that's not something we ought to go back to.
Yeah.
Any
Right.
more than Israel, though they often said, oh, let's go back to Egypt, things were better there.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not quite that bold to state it that way. We just find that it's convenient to go back to the world. So if we think about that, that is, I'm called out of the world, then John says, don't love the world, neither the things that are in the world. And he goes on to say that if you're loving the world, the love of the Father is not in you. Those are strong words.
Yeah.
He doesn't say you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
He just says you're not being a consistent Christian.
Right.
So if we look at that, so what creates the problem is now the word church has been lost for its true meaning, a biblical meaning, I would say, and it's now all associated with what we see in a building in a local setting. So I'm not saying, oh, you can't do this, but if you're going to do it, you've got to keep in mind and keep saying to yourself, yeah, but this is just a physical place. This is not really the church.
Mm-hmm.
We say, I'm going to church. What's the church going to do, et cetera, et cetera. We always mean the local church as opposed to the universal church. I'm one that holds to there's both a local church and a universal church.
Yeah.
So until we can reinstate this fundamental idea and help people to see, Christians to see, that if I've been called out of the world, it certainly is rather absurd to now make myself in different ways accept part of the world, or even bring the world into the corporate body of Christ through different means. So fundamentally, we have this idea of being called out.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about it, it has such strong implications. Interesting that we should see it that way. That's the word that is chosen to be called out. And you got saved at 20. I've got saved at 20. That must make us the same age.
That reasoning seems tight to me.
And I think, oh my, when I come to gather on Sunday morning, how do we view the people around us? Do we view the people around us? Now coming back to your idea of fragmentation, or Wells's idea of fragmentation, because we learn in Ephesians chapter 4 that there's one body and there's one spirit, just as we are called to one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father over all. Now, I know we'll have our divisions and all of that, but we should constantly be reminded we're not a fragmented group. We've been called by the same Savior. We're indwelt by the same Spirit. We confess one faith, and we enter one baptism. That's, you say, so that moves the discussion when we talk about what we're going to do in the local church in terms of activity. Those are the things that ought to be informing us. It's kind of putting the guardrails up and say, well, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? So we find one of my pet peeves, of course, is the big flat screen in the auditorium that focuses us on the wrong thing.
Hmm.
Flat screens, television is designed for entertainment. Now that's very distracting. But you see, it does nothing to reinforce one faith, one hope, one baptism, one God and Father of all. It does nothing to even subliminally underwrite that kind of thing, that kind of thinking.
Yeah. To pick up on that example of the screen,
Mm,
we could probably talk about hundreds of different areas where we haven't even asked the question about that. Does this support what it means to be a called out people, distinct
yeah,
from the world? And when you describe the church that way, as you said, to be called out from something, to be called to something, this is saying an awful lot more than just I show up at a building and gather together with these people on a Sunday. I
mhm.
mean, it seems to me that when I read my New Testament, it's really trying to describe a total reorientation of my entire life
Yes.
from top to bottom.
Yeah.
The way I spend my time, the way I spend my money, what I consider appropriate entertainment. I mean, we read the early church that they could have gone to the Colosseum and watched men and women get slaughtered out there and whatnot, but many of them said that's not appropriate for us to do.
Mhm.
And as it was common in those days to share the marriage bed with people coming into town and whatnot, and this stuff was just running rampant, the Christians said we don't do that. And going and rescuing babies that had maybe been cast out, left
Yes.
to die, all
Yeah.
those sorts of things that we think
Yeah.
back to the early church. We think how easy it's easy for us to see that now. It's very
Yes.
easy for us to look at that now because it's outside of our context. But when I look at that, I think, Lord, what are the Colosseums and the sharing of marriage beds and the babies cast in the trash heaps
Mm,
around us today that are all over the place and much more subtle than that, because there's just been this slow, steady creep of naturalism, the belief that God's not really there. There is no such spiritual thing, that we just measure things not by any kind of intrinsic value given what they are, but we measure them by whether or not it's convenient to my life,
mm,
gives me greater efficiency, puts another dollar in my pocket, those sorts of things, or another, sadly in the church, another person in the pew.
mhm.
Not that we don't want more people in the pew, but what do we do to, get that? Yeah, I was thinking as well along the lines of the church where I've written it here. It's 1 Timothy chapter 3, where we're told that the church is a pillar and support of
True.
truth.
Yes.
And,
That's right.
you mentioned Schaeffer. Even in his day, one of the things he was so concerned about was not just that people were denying true things, but that they were denying truth categorically as something real. And that hasn't gotten any better.
We've been obviously the another area of the accommodation is that we never accommodated theologically naturalism. We were too smart for that. But we let it come right in through the back door of the church through convenience and efficiency.
Yeah, and see that's the part that's so subtle that it's easy to miss, and that's why I think even well-meaning people, they just haven't thought about this. They don't know that there's been compromise in these areas. Because they still think, no, we affirm Jesus as Lord. There's
That's
one way to be saved. They may even affirm a biblical sexuality and take some knocks in that area, all those things, but it's these other areas that just cause, what's the word? It's dissonance to the Christian faith and Christian message and what it means to be called out ones.
Yeah, and you're right. And as we see this worked out, so we just ask ourselves, let's go back, let's go back. Well, Schaeffer would go back to the 1940 and 1984. David Wells, another 10 years later, uh, when they saw all these things happening, and Schaeffer puts his finger on as what he called the new evangelical, who they had a richer and deeper understanding of the scriptures, he said, and he said that sarcastically.
Hmm.
Um, so then we ask ourselves the question, has that made the church stronger?
Yeah.
So as we look at the church, we say, oh, we may be bigger, but it hasn't made us, has our spirituality been deepened?
Yeah.
Has our commitment, you know, I was not long ago, we were singing this hymn in the church. You may know it because you remember when we used to have hymn books. Um, the old hymn, "The way of the cross leads home."
Yep.
Now there's a truth to that, but Jesus says the way of the cross leads to self-denial.
Yes.
So when we sing "The way of the cross leads home," that's our emphasis on our salvation, and it's right.
Yeah.
But we've left the other part unsaid.
Yeah. I was just reading today where Jesus says so clearly that if anyone wants to follow him,
Right.
we have to deny ourselves, pick up our cross,
Yeah.
and then follow after him. There has to be the self-denial and the cross. And I've always thought, I remember as a new believer thinking if Jesus were some huckster trying to peddle some false religion, he would never have said something like that. He would have said something far more palatable than, if you want to come after me, here's what it's going to cost and here's what it's going to look like. I'll just share one story here, and I think we can wrap up. I remember Stephen Olford preached a message, and I found this on YouTube a while back. You know, he was a hero of mine. He was invited to some church to preach, and when he showed up, he said, you know, if memory serves me correct, he said, I think you had asked me to address a certain topic. He said, but I really needed to steer it in another direction because of the urgency of the day. And he said, I need to talk about really living for Christ and what it means to walk with him. And he just went, the whole message was centered around this idea of self-denial, sacrifice, and what Schaeffer's after in true spirituality. I mean, it's almost just Olford saying it a different way, but the same kind of a message. And I'll never forget, I think this was in the early 90s, maybe. Olford said, when I look around at the evangelical church today in America, he said, bit money's coming in. He said, but where is the real life of Christ in me? And he just went on and hammered that so powerfully. And that has stuck with me. I read that in Schaeffer. I heard Olford preach that. And I think that so much of what you're talking about when we started the discussion about sacrifices, it's I don't do the right thing just because it lines up with necessarily a moral code, although it does. I do the right thing because of the kind of person I am. And if I want to be close with Christ and really walk with him, I might make decisions like your dentist made and all sorts of other decisions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And when we think about what you've just been saying, the idea of sacrifice, we've talked about that. And the sacrifice, I think, today comes from a deeper thinking about the world we live in. And then it's going to be saying, no, I don't do that. I don't mean, all right, I don't sleep with my neighbor's wife.
Yeah,
That's
that's the obvious
obvious.
stuff, right?
That's the obvious one. No, I don't, I'm not going to accept this idea. This idea is contrary to the teaching of Scripture. Somebody said, well, what verse? Say, it's not the verse. It's the entire Bible. You know,
Yeah.
we've gotten into this idea of, oh, this is my favorite verse. And if you want to have a favorite verse, that's okay for me. Maybe it's because it meant something to you, your salvation. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that you can live your Christian life from one verse is like singing a song with one note.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to, it is from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation. It's being informed by God's ways, whether we see it in history or we see it in propositional truth. And so all of those things work together to build what we talk about so glibly is a Christian worldview,
Yeah.
which no, I think so few understand what that's all about today because it's just, detailed it academically. But
Yeah.
a Christian worldview is a vision of reality that starts from understanding what Genesis says all the way to what Revelation says, and then viewing our life in and from that perspective. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just one verse. It's really being able, though, to say, no, say, well, why would you say no to this? I say, well, because this idea here, it sounds good until we put it to the test.
Yeah.
And if this is true, then what else is true? If I'm going to agree that this is true and this is okay, then what does that mean for this? What does it mean for this area? So, from, as you know, I've traveled in many different places, and I'm surprised from Cuba to Africa to Europe. I have been asked to talk on critical thinking for Christians.
Mm.
And the reason that sacrifice is so limited today is because they only see it in the quote more obvious areas, but they haven't thought in terms of ideas.
Yeah.
What is the idea? What is the idea behind this thing I've just accepted into the church? Well, the idea is efficiency and convenience. Okay, but are those the only two standards by which we allow something to come into the church? Let's just think about it a little bit further. It's asking questions. And then that will bring us to, I think, where the real area of sacrifice is being able to say, no, I'm sorry. Not just say, it may be in your workplace.
Yeah.
And you just have to say, no, I'm sorry. My God doesn't permit that.
Yeah.
And it may seem like a small thing. And of course, you should do it with prayer and try to work around it if you can. But if you can't, you just have to say, no, I can't do that. That's the real area. And I think that's where it's going to cost us in this day, because it's increasingly, people are increasingly unsympathetic with the Christian idea, the Christian religion. They are totally unsympathetic. So it's going to become, you see, more and more areas where we're probably just going to have to say no. And that's when we need each other.
Yes.
And that's when we need the unity. And that's when we need, I confess the same faith. I've gone through the same baptism. I confess them dwelt by the same Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where I gain my strength, is in the unity that we have.
That's really good. Well, I'm going to stop.